Today's lesson is Students in U.S. Protest War in Gaza. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're talking about Gaza, which, as you know, is in the Middle East. It's part of Palestine, and there's been a war there recently because of some attack at a musical festival or something like that in Israel. And as a result, they've gone to war over those hostages. And, of course, students in the United States are against that war. They think Israel are doing something really terrible there, so they're protesting the evil Israelis and what they're doing in Gaza.
Exactly right. Yes, this all stems from the October 7th attacks of last year. As Roger said, they attacked the music festival, but also many Jewish communities right around the border with Gaza. Around 1,200 people, I believe, were killed. About 200 were kidnapped, taken back to Gaza. And as the time we're recording this, around 120 of those people are still being held hostage in Gaza. And this, of course, has created a very violent situation. A lot of innocent people are being killed, and a lot of the students feel that Israel's attacks on largely civilian areas with just normal men, women, and children living in them, are going a little too far. The violence is getting out of control, and the students want to see an end to the war. So let's find out how the war in the Middle East, or this conflict in Israel and Gaza, has affected student life and university campuses all around the world, specifically in America, by reading the first part of the article. Students in U.S. protest war in Gaza. Earlier this year, thousands of university students across the U.S. took to the streets and set up camps at their colleges to protest the ongoing war in Gaza. Among their demands was that their universities cut ties with companies that do business with or in Israel.
Okay, it's time for us to talk about the first part of the article, but first we'll talk about the title. In the title, we have the word protest, and as a verb, this word is supposed to be pronounced protest, but most people I know, and most of the time when I'm listening on the news, they will pronounce it as protest. Students protest the war in Gaza. I don't know what the case is in Canada, but in the U.S. at least, we tend to say protest for both the noun and the verb forms.
That's right. English is a language of exceptions. So generally, if you're using it as a verb, you are going to protest and you're going to protest. So the verb would be, the stress would be on the second syllable. As a noun, if you're going to protest, or if you read about a protest in the newspaper, it would be on the first syllable. You're right. A lot of people would say students in the U.S. protest the war on Gaza. But if you're shouting out loud in the court, you wouldn't say, I protest. You would say, I protest. So it's a little bit about the usage of it. So yes, but as Roger says, generally using the noun form, even if you're talking about or using the word as a verb, is probably okay. All right, so let's check out the article. It says, earlier this year, thousands of university students across the U.S. took to the streets and set up camps at their colleges to protest the ongoing war in Gaza. So that's exactly what happened. This is going back to the months of April and May of earlier this year, before the summer holiday started. But thousands of university students across the U.S., most of the biggest protests were in New York, I think at NYU and at Columbia University there in New York, and also at UCLA over on the West Coast, in LA in California. Those were some of the biggest protests, but they actually had them at hundreds of colleges across the U.S. And so students took to the streets. That would be a pretty typical protest, right? You march in the street, you have your signs, you have your chants, you say, we don't like this, we want change. So it could be a political issue, you could be protesting for more jobs, more money from the government, cleaning the environment, all sorts of reasons to have a protest. And generally, yes, people take to the streets. They march in the streets, they have street rallies, street demonstrations. That's what we're talking about there. They're not just writing angry letters to politicians or things like that. They're actually taking action out in public. And in some cases, yeah, on the campuses themselves, on the university grounds, they set up camps So students would sort of leave their homes and put tents out there, have little temporary pop-up communities where many of these people with similar political ideas could gather together, share their outrage, listen to speeches, organize, and things like that. And of course, this is a very visible symbol of the protest. Every time you were walking from your class to the library, you'd go by this camp and you would hear the speeches, see the signs, and it's all in order to keep this issue front and center in people's minds, hoping that that will lead to an ending of the war in Gaza.
And among their demands was that their universities cut ties with companies that do business with or in Israel. Okay, so they had lots of demands. If you're protesting something, of course, you have some demands, things that you want as a result of your protests. We may demand higher wages, for example, if you're protesting the government policy on farming or whatever. Maybe farmers aren't getting paid enough, so you demand an increase in salary or something like that. But, of course, they had lots of demands with the people who ran the university. They first of all wanted the universities to cut ties with companies that do business in or with Israel. So if you cut ties with something or someone, you break off your relationship with them. You no longer work together. And yes, lots of universities in the U.S. probably do business with Israel, and they might even do business in Israel. And of course, these protesters don't like Israel. They don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza, so they want the universities to cut those ties with Israel.
Yeah, absolutely right. Don't invest in Israeli companies, and maybe other things like don't do research with Israeli universities. Don't send our professors there to teach in their schools. Basically, start to isolate Israel in the international community as a way of showing that people are very upset and disapprove of Israel's actions. All right, so let's take a break here and listen to the next part of the article, which will be describing one of the specific demonstrations there at Columbia University in New York City. On April 18th, university administrators at Columbia University in New York lost patience with the protesters on campus there. Police were called in to break up protest camps and remove students from university buildings that they had taken over. This led to further protests and similar police actions at other campuses nationwide, with hundreds of students ultimately being arrested.
大家好，请看到第二部分的名词 administrator， 它表示学校、企业、政府事务的管理人或是监督者。例如 ，As an administrator, you need to have strong leadership and management skills. 作为管理员，你需要具备强大的领导和管理技能。或者 Astrid worked as a nurse for years before becoming a hospital administrator. Astrid 在成为医院行政人员之前，曾经当过多年的护士。继续看到副词 nationwide， 它的意思是遍布全国。例如 The television station is planning to broadcast a talk show nationwide. 该电视台正计划在全国播出脱口秀节目。也可以说 The product is available nationwide in all major stores. 这款产品在全国各大商店都有贩售。接着看到 ultimately 这个单字，它是副词，表示最后、最终，也可以是归根究底。例如 After much consideration, they ultimately decided to move forward with the project. 经过深思熟虑后，他们最终决定这项专案要继续进行。或是 A good diet and exercise are ultimately the main factors in staying healthy. 良好的饮食和运动最终是保持健康的主要因素。
Okay, let's talk about the second paragraph here. It says, on April 18th, which was earlier this year, university administrators at Columbia University in New York lost patience with the protesters on campus there. Okay, so yes, it's nice if protesters come out and tell you what they want and what they demand from the university administrators, but maybe sometimes they go too far. They interfere with the students' education. So Columbia had had enough. They lost patience with those protesters, and they did something about it. Now, of course, if you talk about people who run things in a university, they are the administrators. and we have a general term for everybody in that part of the university that runs the university. That is the administration. Okay, so that's all the people who work together to run the place. They get the money and they pay people and they make sure everything's running smoothly. So they're the administrators, and they finally had enough. No, you guys can't do that anymore. You're causing problems.
Absolutely right. So yes, they wanted to break up the protest camps. It says police were called in to break up protest camps and remove students from university buildings that they had taken over. So normally the university might be quite patient with this, might be quite tolerant with this. These are students. They're trying to learn things. They're working through their ideas. Protesting and knowing why we do it and how to do it is kind of a good thing, right? It keeps our democracies healthy, keeps people in power from doing whatever they want. We're holding them to account for their actions. But they felt that the protests were going on too much, too long, and as Roger said, were disrupting normal school life. So they called in. Basically, they asked for help from the NYPD, from the New York Police Department, which, as we said, is not something universities would do very lightly. They don't want the police to come in and have conflict with their students. But they asked the police to come in, break up the camps, remove the camps that were blocking areas of the university grounds or campus, and remove or get the students out of university buildings. I believe they had taken over like a university office building or something like that. They'd taken over these buildings. Students had kind of invaded the buildings, locked the doors. They weren't letting professors or other people have access to these buildings, again, as a way of showing their disapproval with the university's behavior and actions. And of course, this led to problems. There was fighting with the police. Not too much, but there was some fighting. I believe a police officer fired his gun by accident, and hundreds of students, I believe, were arrested and taken away to the police station to face a judge in the future. So this led to further protests. So at this time, other students who maybe weren't active in the original protests, they came out to protest the university using the police to sort of attack these students, not just at Columbia, but at other campuses nationwide across the country. This led to other protests against Columbia, its administrators, the people who run the school, and the New York police, their actions in sort of taking on these protesters.
Right, and of course that led to police actions and protests at other campuses nationwide, all over the country. That's what nationwide means. From coast to coast, you could say, from New York to California, from North Dakota down to Texas. They were having protests at those campuses all over the place, and the police were getting involved with those protests. Nationwide, you could apply that to other countries as well. And, of course, hundreds of students were ultimately, in the end, arrested. I don't know how long they could keep them in prison because American prisons, of course, are just stuffed with people. And I don't think they have any room for any more. But they were arrested and hauled away. And, of course, they probably had their pictures taken. And they posted those pictures online. And, of course, they became online celebrities rather quickly.
I think most of the students were just arrested for trespassing, for not obeying the commands of a police officer. I don't think there was a whole lot of violence or anything like that.
They didn't beat him or anything?
No, I don't think there was too much of that. So it was mainly just for protesting where they shouldn't be on university grounds when they're not allowed to be. But yes, definitely a very interesting experience for the students at that time. All right, so let's take a break here. We're going to have a bit of historical perspective on these recent university protests and how they maybe compare with university protests in the U.S. in the past. The protest drew comparisons to the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of the 1960s and 1970s and sparked discussions about free speech and campus security. U.S. President Joe Biden weighed in, emphasizing the importance of peaceful dissent. Speaking at the White House, Biden stated, "There's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos." Yet protesters remained defiant, promising to continue demonstrating until their demands were met and the war was brought to an end.
第三部分介绍动词 spark， 表示引发或是引起。我们可以说 The coach's powerful speech sparked a renewed sense of passion in the team. 教练铿锵有力的演说重新点燃了球队的热情。又或者说 Visiting the National Gallery sparked Ian's interest in art. 参观国家艺廊引起伊恩对艺术的兴趣。后面看到名词 dissent， 它的意思是异议或是意见不一致。例如 Dissent is crucial in a democratic society。 在民主社会中，异议是至关重要的。又或者说 The government's action sparked widespread dissent。 该政府的行动引发了广泛的异议。再来我们看到 chaos 这个单字，它是名词，指的是混乱或是无秩序的状态。举例来说 With the kids tearing open their presents and shrieking with joy, Christmas morning was the picture of chaos。 孩子们开心的一边尖叫一边拆礼物，使得圣诞节早上呈现一幅混乱的景象。又或者说 Without laws, society would probably be in chaos。 没有法律，社会可能会陷入混乱。最后看到形容词 defiant， 它表示违抗的、态度强硬的或是挑衅的。我们可以说 The suspect was defiant as he faced the judge in court。 该嫌犯在法庭上面对法官桀骜不驯。也可以说 The politician remained defiant in spite of the scandal involving his staff。 尽管下属丑闻缠身，那名政治人物仍态度强硬。
Okay, let's look at the third and final part of our lesson for today. It says, the protest drew comparisons to the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of the 1960s and 1970s and sparked discussions about free speech and campus security. So yeah, whenever you have these big protests, people will immediately start comparing them to the protests that took place back in the 60s and 70s when the hippies were opposed to the Vietnam War. You may recall that America was involved in a war in Vietnam, and lots of people in the United States were against that war, so they had these demonstrations, which is similar. Lots of students showed up on campus and they let their opinions be known, U.S. out of Vietnam and stuff like that. But the new ones are kind of different because I don't remember the Vietnam demonstrations having tents and people camping out on the campuses overnight.
Well, they did at Columbia, the same university that these protests happened at back in the 60s and maybe early 70s. Students also took over some of the buildings, had sit-ins, things like that. But I don't believe the police were called in quite so much. So that was one of the interesting things where people draw comparisons. They're making comparisons. They're kind of pointing out, hey, there was this other thing. How does it relate to this thing we're talking about? Let's make some comparisons. Let's look at how similar they are, how different they are, and in what ways they are similar and different. So this is the most recent and probably the biggest student protests we've seen in the U.S. since the Vietnam War, right? We've had the Gulf War. We've had some other things like that with America doing actions around the world that haven't led to such widespread and very loud protests from large numbers of students. And the demonstrations of the 60s and 70s, yes, were widespread. They started off in many university campuses, but then eventually they led to protests in high schools and even protests among workers and things like that. So a demonstration is very similar to a protest, okay? If you're going downtown to rally with a bunch of people, hundreds or thousands of people, to all shout and yell and make speeches and hear speeches about something you're upset about, some change you want, that's a demonstration of some kind, or a protest generally of some kind. So this is back in the 60s and 70s. So this sort of led to or sparked discussions about free speech and campus security, all right? So we're talking about the news. What happened at Columbia? What happened at UCLA? The police came in. They arrested X number of students. So that's what happened. But then this leads to other discussions about bigger ideas like free speech. Should these students be allowed to say whatever they want to say for as long as they want to say it, or should we put limits on this? In which case you're limiting free speech. Is that a good or a bad thing? How about campus security? Should we be calling in the police with their sticks and dogs and things like that to chase students out of university buildings, or should we try to find a more peaceful way of ending the protests? So not just in Columbia or UCLA, but in general, looking at these big issues and how they affect people.
bread, and people will be looking for answers, so they might ask the top dog, hey, what do you think about this Joe Biden? So the president weighed in, and he emphasized the importance of peaceful dissent. If you weigh in, usually in boxing, that means you take your weight before you get into the ring to fight your opponent. So here to weigh in just means to offer your opinion, and he said, yes, we do have something important, having peaceful dissent, okay, which means you don't agree, you have dissent, people don't agree. So yes, we should have that opportunity to express our opinions. But speaking at the White House, Biden stated, there's the right to protest, but not the right to cause chaos. And chaos, of course, is a very chaotic or rather wild, uncontrolled situation. So that's true. Yeah, you can protest, but you can't cause trouble. And it goes on to say, yet, still, protesters remained defiant, promising to continue demonstrating until their demands were met and the war was brought to an end. So if you're defiant, that means you're not going to give up. You're not going to do what people tell you to do. They were going to stay there. Nope, we're not going to leave the campus because we want the war in Gaza to end, and those are our demands. We want our demands met. We want you to agree to our demands, and then we'll leave. We want the war to be brought to an end, to stop the war, and then they can go on living peacefully. Okay, we're at the end of our discussion for today. Here comes Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文这一篇文章是关于美国学生抗议加萨战争。那么标题用到抗议这个单字，它当动词念作 protest， 它当名词念作 protest。 那我们来学它的字首字根。好，看到 test 这个字根，它有 witness 的意思，表示见证人啊、证物、证词。那么在 protest 这个字当中，它的字首 pro 表示往前，那么字根 test 表示证明。那同学们可以试着用挺身向前证明自己的清白，或者是挺身向前证明自己的论点，去联想 protest 它有那种反对抗议的意思。好，那顺便补充两个有相同字根的单字。第一个是 contest， 它的字首 con 表示一起，那么字根 test 表示见证。那么在法律诉讼的这种攻防战里面，提告和被告双方都需要召唤证人，我们可以从这个场景去联想到contest 当动词，它有争辩、抗辩的意思。那么当名词念作 contest， 表示竞争、竞赛。第二个补充的单字是 testify， 它的字根 test 表示见证， ify 是动词字尾，那合在一起 testify 它就有作证啊、证明的意思。好，那么在课文第三部分有一句提到说，美国总统拜登发表意见，强调了和平意义的重要性。文中他用到 dissent 这个字来表达意义。那我们来学它的字首字根，看到 sent 或是 sens 或者是拼作 sense 这一类的字根呢，它带有知觉、感觉、认为的意思。那么在 dissent 这个字当中，它的字首 dis 表示不同，字根 sent 表示感觉、认为。那有不同的感觉、不同的看法，应该可以联想到 dissent 它是指异议、意见不一致，它也可以当名词或者是当动词用。好，那我们这边要补充几个带有相同字根的单字。第一个补充的是 consent， 它的字首 con 表示共同，字根 sent 表示感觉。那对某事有相同的感觉、共同的看法，应该很容易联想到 consent， 它有同意、赞成的意思。第二个补充的是 resent， 它的字首 re 是做强调用，字根 sent 是感觉。那么当这个感受非常的强烈，尤其是负面情绪非常强烈，我们可以用这个方式来联想 resent， 它有那种怨恨啊、感到愤恨的意思，它是当动词来用。第三个补充的是 sentiment， 它的字根 sent 表示感觉，那么 ment 是名词字尾，合在一起 sentiment 它表示感想、观点、意见或者是情绪、心情。我们在后面加上了形容词字尾 al 变成 sentimental， 那就是形容感性的、多愁善感的或是感伤的。好，那么以上是今天的重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Protest.People have been protesting outside the factory against the pollution it produces. Demand. The workers' union presented their demands for better wages to the company's management. Administrator. As a school administrator, Mrs. Morgan is responsible for managing some of the school's daily operations. Ultimately. Calvin ultimately failed to achieve his goal of being elected class president. Demonstration. A huge demonstration against the war was held in the city's main square. Spark. David's jokes sparked laughter among the group. Chaos. The sudden storm caused chaos on the streets, with fallen trees blocking many roads.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, would you ever consider joining a protest? If yes, why? If no, why not?
I would be willing to take part in a protest since I'm a firm believer in that old idea that the only thing that evil needs to win is for good people to do nothing. And in a free and open society, protest is good. It keeps the powerful accountable.
Well, I don't think I'd ever consider participating in a protest again. I think I took part in such protests back in my college years, but nowadays I've grown kind of tired of crowds, and I'm afraid that if I'm in the middle of a big crowd of thousands of people and I need to go to the bathroom, I just won't be able to take care of that problem. So yeah, I won't participate in any protests anytime soon.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.